ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. Today I would like to do a short expansion on the video that I made last time, as well as to cover a new topic. That is to say, I want to first shortly cover a little bit more about Pokemon Sword and Shield, and then I would like to go into the topic of, hey, if I had a reasonable modern AA, AAA standard-ish budget, and if I had the opportunity to design a Pokemon game as per my own direction, what would it look like? What would my ideal Pokemon game look like? In the background you'll be seeing a long play. The footage is by PokeaimMD, so all credits to him or her. So let's first cover a little bit about Pokemon Sword and Shield. I have not bought it. At the moment I do not intend to buy it. That is for various reasons. Personally, I do not yet have a Switch. I think there are a lot of good games on the Switch, but it does not yet have the amount of exclusives that has forced me into buying a Switch as of yet. So a lot of games that would have traditionally gotten my attention, like Zelda Breath of the Wild, the upcoming Bayonetta 3 with the collection of Bayonetta 1 and 2, Smash Brothers, you name it, those kinds of games would have had me buy a Switch usually. However, I have most of the originals on the Nintendo Wii U, so because of that reason I do not feel compelled enough yet to buy a Switch. Pokemon Sword and Shield would have been the tipping point for me to buy one if it had been a Pokemon game that I'd really look forward to. At the moment it doesn't look like Pokemon Sword and Shield is that game. It looks more like Pokemon Sword and Shield is just a good game, or at times even a very good game that is held back by some archaic design choices. So among other things, I am not that interested in the wild area. I think it's a cool concept, but really the way that the map is laid out, the way that the Pokemons are placed there, the map design, most of all really the aesthetic part of it all, it's not that interesting to me, and that's a more widespread opinion on the wild area, that it doesn't look as developed as it should, that it doesn't look as complete as it should. I'm not that satisfied with the visuals and the animations of Pokemon Sword and Shield, and yes, graphics aren't everything, but I do think that the biggest franchise probably on the planet should at least live up to some of the modern standards when it's trying to be on the home console. This is a $60 product or a €60 product depending on where you live, and I think that it should be worth that money, and from what I'm seeing right now I think that this game should be 40, not 60. Obviously the game does run at 1080p, which is nice, but I think that for the visuals on display, maybe if this game ran at 60 frames per second, that would have been a decent argument for me to be like, yeah, I'm interested. But as it stands right now, this game is unstable 30 frames per second. Mostly it is stable within the towns, etc. when you're by yourself, but especially people have been reporting that there are a lot of frame drops when you are playing together with other people for the Dynamax battles in the wild area, etc. And that doesn't really speak to me whatsoever. Another reason why this Pokemon game doesn't really appeal to me is because, as it turned out, the story was fairly shallow, and that's not much of a surprise. Pokemon isn't really known to be some kind of literature masterpiece or whatever. It's not known for its huge plot twists and such, and that's fine. However, I was looking for a bit more than what Pokemon delivered right now. I think that some of the YouTubers, I don't know who it was, but somebody made predictions about the Pokemon story and said that Director Rose would actually turn out to be a good guy, but his assistant was the person playing the strings in the background all along, and etc, etc. This person's theories and video spoke to me much more than the actual story we got in the game. I also think that the way that the legendaries were handled was rather underwhelming. Yes, I think that Zacian and Zamazenta look cool, but I think that the presentation is really holding back what these legendaries could mean, could be, how epic they should feel, but they don't. So for those reasons, wait, and I'll probably get a sale later, either with the Switch. So between my previous video and me recording this video now, a fair amount of things have changed. Obviously the game has released since then, and it's by now been confirmed that the models are in fact reused, at least the recurring Pokemon to some extent. Some of them have had different try-up counts, some of them slightly higher, some of them actually slightly lower, but more or less the models are reused a vast majority of the time. Also, it has been discovered that there are actually more Pokemon in the code than we essentially thought when the original leaks happened. There's about 35-ish Pokemons more, including your Bulbasaurs and your Turtles, your Blastoises, your Squirtles, name it. All of those are actually in, and there just appears to be no way to capture them just yet, which kind of indicates that these Pokemon will be event Pokemon that will release later on. I do think it is important to emphasize why the national dex is a bit of a shame, because I don't think that Pokemon Sword and Shield lacks Pokemon quantity. I think that over 400 Pokemon is a good amount of Pokemon to have within a Pokemon game native to the actual region. I think it's higher than most every other Pokemon game that has been released so far, and as well, frankly, Pokemon Sun and Moon did not have a national dex either. But at least you could import your old Pokemon into Pokemon Sun, Moon, Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, etc. It's a nice feeling for players to have. And for me personally, even though the national dex isn't necessarily that important, to me what is a big shame is how Game Freak presented this game as having all kinds of new models, as being a huge graphical overhaul for them, truly trying to establish some kinds of ambition they just did not live up to. I think that in a way their marketing was a lie. Not even in a way, they just straight up lied about the way that they handled their models. They straight up lied about the animations as well. And I think that's a shame. I think that if you're going to play a game on a console, it should meet console standards, and right now, to me, Pokemon Sword and Shield does not meet the standards set by the market. I also think that a lot of people emphasizing that Pokemon Sword and Shield is the best looking Pokemon game, and therefore it is the best Pokemon game, or that Game Freak did good work because Pokemon Sword and Shield looks better than Pokemon Moon and Sun. I think that's a ridiculous argument, to be honest. More than comparing it to your previous entries, you should think about, okay, what franchise is this? What does this franchise compete against? What platform does this franchise launch on? And we are talking about the biggest media platform on the planet, biggest franchise, and I'm sure that Game Freak doesn't necessarily have a huge budget considering the studio size at the moment. I also think that Game Freak is kind of rooted in their indie studio roots back when they were still Game Boy developers, and I also think that probably Nintendo and the Pokemon Company both take a pretty big cut from the budget that would otherwise be allotted to Game Freak. Those things hold back the size of what a Pokemon game could be. It's not going to have the budget of a Grand Theft Auto, obviously, but I do think that if easily had a larger budget that would have been more comparable to those of other RPGs from the market. It's kind of ridiculous that in some ways Pokemon Sword and Shield is behind on games from the PlayStation 2 era. And I don't just mean the shitty textures on the trees or lack of water effects at times, etc. That's not what I'm getting at. I mean more so when it comes to basic presentation quality. Voice acting. Why is the music still inspired by 16-bit stuff? Like, yes, it's cool in a way because it's kind of a legacy thing to have this MIDI music, to have 16-bit-ish sounds, even though actually the in-game sound isn't 16-bit anymore, it just is made to kind of sound like it. But I really think that Pokemon should have modernized by now. It's kind of crazy how a game like Final Fantasy XII has at times better modeling, has more interesting animations at times, has voice acting, even though the voice acting was cheesy as hell. You know, that's a PlayStation 2 era game. And I really think that it shows just how far behind the market Pokemon is. Those kinds of things make me uninterested in buying the product at full price. So let's actually talk a bit about what I wanted to cover today. if I had a reasonable AA/AAA budget, what would I want a Pokemon game to look like on the Switch? I think is reasonable. Or maybe even the successor to the Switch. I guess it doesn't really matter, considering backwards compatibility is becoming more and more of a thing again. So, to me, I think that an ideal Pokemon game should be made on a budget of $60 million-ish, maybe 70, 80, which is about the standard set by the PlayStation 3 era of consoles. That's when the budget of games really started to bloat and become these high, sometimes even 100 million plus budget games. I don't think that Pokemon needs a budget comparable to like Destiny over 100 million, or Grand Theft Auto, or Red Dead Redemption 2 close to 200 million. That would be overkill. There is no way that would be a reasonable investment, so we're not going to assume that these will be the prettiest graphics ever created within the cel-shaded art style. Instead, let's give it something more reasonable, 60 to 80 million, so that Game Freak can expand its studio to about 300-ish people, which is more or less a doubling in their size. I think that a majority of those would be animators as well as graphics artists, to make sure that the visuals are more interesting, but I think that they should also hire more traditional cel animators, much like you would see in an anime. I'll get into why that is. I think that the next Pokemon game would really be interesting if they would put more of a thought on the story and its presentation. I think that they should take a page from Persona in how they present the story. That is to say, I would want to have a predefined character. I want the main character, it doesn't really matter if it's a boy or a girl, but at least give that person personality. That is to say, give your person a voice, give your character likes and dislikes, a history, if he or she moved from Kanto to Johto or wherever the game takes place, give a bit of a backstory as to why, maybe build up some characters from that original home of the main character, so that that character can maybe make a cameo later on in the story. I think it's really important for the main character to have a personality. I'd like to see something more in the vein of Geralt. That is to say, a very well-defined character who has this history, who does want to become the best Pokemon trainer. That is something that he has always aspired to, and maybe that is because this main character grew up seeing Ash become the champion in the Alola region. That kind of stuff. Actual motivation to want to be the best. And that can also inspire other characters within the story. The next Pokemon game should take a slightly more mature approach. I think it would be useful if, instead of appealing only to kids, the next Pokemon game goes for something more along the teenager route. So that doesn't mean that I'm expecting a lot of nudity or heavy violence, but I would appreciate it if characters had a bit more depth to them than, for example, How from Moon, who is just always happy and always jolly, and the same is for Hop, who the main character is battling in the Sword and Shield footage right now. Like, Hop is a bit of a one-note character. He's just this happy dude and I think that's holding Pokemon back. I think that you can invest players more into their journey by actually making these rivals more challenging during battle, and also by giving them their own motivations beyond, oh hey neighbor, I want to be the best just like you, let's have a battle. Oh no, I lost. Well, that's fine, because I still really like Pokemon battle. That's really what a lot of NPC characters, rival characters in the Pokemon games comes down to, and I think that is a bit of a shame. Instead, it would be much more interesting if the game would maybe start off with you having a team of 3 Pokemon-ish, and you get to go into your first gym battle, which you are going to lose. Maybe with a bit of luck you can win, kind of like in Dark Souls you have that first boss which you are kind of intended to lose to, but if you have enough skill you can win. I think that's a really cool concept for your main character, in the next Pokemon game as I would like to see it, where you can actually experience loss, or where you can maybe experience your rival, who's also a good friend of yours, have them experience loss, push them to question themselves, like, hey, why is it that I lost? And that could be a good point to actually explain mechanics of the game. Did you lose because you didn't use super effective moves, or maybe your rival lost because he or she didn't use super effective moves? Was it because of the way that your rival trained his or her Pokemon? Did the rival just keep spamming attacks instead of encouraging evasion? Did your rival just not train Pokemon enough? Did your rival think that, hey, if I catch 3 or 4 Pokemon, I'm good enough to win? And it turns out that you aren't. You have to work for it. These questions could be very interesting if presented within a Pokemon game, but they just aren't at the moment. And I also think that this growth in character development could be a good outlet for the game to actually explain its own mechanics to the player. In my ideal Pokemon game, I would like to see a Pokédex of 400 to 500 Pokemon, which is not very dissimilar from the current Pokemon count in Sword and Shield. I think actually that most of the Pokemon models currently in Sword and Shield are kind of fine, but at least I would want all of them to have improved animations. And that sounds like a whole lot of work, but it's actually not as crazy as you initially think. I'm not expecting a unique animation for every single attack in the game, because that's ridiculous. Instead, make the character models a bit more animated and interesting. A YouTube channel called Lockstin, or Gnoggin, made a good example of this as well quite recently. He talked about how, as of yet in Pokemon Sword and Shield, etc., most of the models are animated to just twist their limbs, their arms or their legs, maybe their head, but the entire body kind of rotates with it. Instead, you can also animate models to animate smaller parts, smaller fractions of the body, so like just the paw, just the ear, just the fur on the sides of Scorbunny's cheek here, and those kinds of things can make attacks a lot more expressive. Physical attacks like double kick should be animated to actually hit the opposing enemy. If you're using a fire punch, I want to see my Charizard fly forward or jump forward and hit the enemy in the face with a fire punch. And it doesn't have to be bloody, I'm not saying that, but at least I want to see the impact, because right now, to me, all physical attacks in the game pretty much feel kind of weak, and that's just not necessary. I don't think that Pokemon will suddenly get into animal abuse when these melee hits from a Charizard on a Zigzagoon are animated correctly. And it's still going to look kind of clunky in a way. I get that, because if a Charizard has to hit a Blastoise or a Gyarados, which is a much taller Pokemon, then the chances are that the Fire Punch is going to go over a small enemy like a Zigzagoon. But I think that little bit of clunk is acceptable. At least having more animated moves with actual impact on the enemy, with Blastoise shooting water out of its cannons, those kinds of small logical details would make the Pokemon game seem like it's at least part of the modern era of video games. I think another great addition to ideal Pokemon game would be multi-tier boss battles. In a way, Pokemon already has them in the Elite Four, considering you don't get to go to a Pokemon Center in between all of the battles, from the first Elite Four member till the champion. That kind of counts as a multi-tier boss battle, but I mean something more traditional, as you would find within a Final Fantasy game, where you get the enemy to 10% HP or to 0% HP, and then a bit of story progression happens and you get thrown into the next battle without being able to recover. I think this should be the way that legendary battles within Pokemon games should work. To me, I think that it is too easy within Pokemon games to have a very over-leveled Pokemon with false swipe, or just any super effective Pokemon get the legendary, like Zapdos, Lugia, Groudon, whatever you name it, to low HP, at which point you use whatever effect on it, sleep paralysis, I don't really care, and you keep on throwing ultra balls at it, or a master ball, or a quick ball at the start of the match, I think that kind of understates the power that these legendaries should have, and that's a big shame. To me, a legendary Pokemon, when you battle it, it should have this epic music, it should feel intimidating. These legendary Pokemon are quite powerful in the games, but they often don't really get to use their power because of how easy it is to make your own Pokemon party extremely powerful. And Pokemon is a very kill heavy meta where 2 or 3 hits is enough, or often even 1 super effective hit is enough to take out a Pokemon. And I don't think that's how you convey the strength of a legendary. Instead, put them in a multi-tier boss battle, have them have a bit more of a bulked up HP, so that you really will struggle, and then make the actual act of throwing Pokeballs when the legendary is weak a bit easier, because I think it's kind of ridiculous how when you're in a legendary battle currently, the vast majority of the time is not you fighting the legendary, it's you surviving against the legendary and throwing ultra balls. That's just not very entertaining to me. Much rather I would have a more challenging battle which ends up with my party being truly damaged, and the legendary being low, so that 2 or 3 or 4 ultra balls is enough. So let's actually go into gameplay changes. How would I like my ideal Pokemon game to function mechanically? I think that most of the fundamentals of Pokemon can be kept, but to me, I think that some of the balancing when it comes to super effective hits should be changed. Pokemon does not get to live up to its own mechanical depth at the moment because of how kill heavy the meta is. As it stands right now, if you look at Smogon or any other, or even when you just play casually on your own 2DS or Switch, 3DS, normal DS, it doesn't matter, any of those Pokemon games, it is too easy to level up your team with or without EXP share and just one-shot enemies via a super effective move. I think this is problematic, especially if it's a super effective move that is also a stab move, the same type attack bonus. Those are problematic to me. I think that those mechanics should stay in the game, but I think that the multipliers should be lowered to make sure that a Pokemon battle can last, at least when it's trainer to trainer, it should last maybe at least 3 or 5 turns, so that you can actually plan things out, so you can do things like properly setting up without having to use some rather advanced strategy like baton passes, like protecting in a double battle. It would be much more interesting if you could set up within a single battle as well, rather than just having a Blaziken with sword stands or bulk up, work up. It doesn't really matter which one you use, because most of the time you can one-shot your enemy anyway. Now for the wild battles, I think it is important that you can still one-shot enemies, because otherwise fighting wild enemy Pokemon will become very tedious, which is a problem with Pokemon games in general and just JRPGs in general. If you play them for over 70 hours and you have to fight a random NPC that spawned in the wild that you couldn't run from or whatever in the overworld, and the battle takes over 5 minutes or whatever, it just becomes boring if it's a wild Pokemon that you already caught, right? There's no purpose to fighting them other than making your strong team even more powerful. For that reason, those Pokemon should be lower level, and maybe their defense parameters compared to trainer Pokemon should be lower. And then instead of that, obviously the actual trainers that you battle, that you encounter, should have higher defense parameters. You can make a differential between wild Pokemon and trained Pokemon, that simple, and trained Pokemon have a multiplier of 1.6 in defense or something like that, or 1.5. Obviously I haven't worked out the math, but that's just an example. This would make gym battles a lot more interesting, I think, a lot more intimidating as well, as they should be, and that is a good thing. Pokemon could use a bit more difficulty as compared to what it has been in recent games. Having a meta in which buffs and nerfs are more prominent will give rise to much more interesting strategic choices, in which you in which it is worth to set up your Blaziken, your Charizard with or buff up, work up, sword stance, or have some kind of Pokemon that has maybe an ability that automatically lowers your opponent's defenses or automatically neutralizes their type so that they don't have a type advantage. I think those abilities would be much more interesting and have much more long-term mechanical variety in a less kill-heavy meta. I also think that Pokemon should be allowed to have 6 moves. This is something that might be a bit more controversial, because if a Pokemon has 6 moves, has more options to complete their moveset, more Pokemon will feel more complete, so there is less reason to cover up weaknesses from one Pokemon with another Pokemon if they can cover up their own weaknesses. I get that, but I still think that having 6 moves on a Pokemon could make for more diversity in your team, could make for more interesting, more mechanically complex multi-Pokemon setups with these baton passes for the advanced players. I think that that is where advanced players will really get their satisfaction from, where they can really plan things out ahead, make these elaborate sequences of Pokemons, stat buffs to other Pokemons in single battles and double battles, etc., which currently the Pokemon games cannot do. So let's talk a bit about the overworld. First of all, having control of the camera with your other stick should be standard within the Pokemon game from start to finish in every single region, not just in the wild area. I think it's very outdated to have a set camera within towns and villages, etc. Not only is having full camera control just a nice bit of control or whatever, that's not the point, but rather it allows players to really look at every part of a town, to enter every single building, because very often in Pokemon games now with a set camera, if a door is kind of out of sight, like at the bottom of your screen, and your camera is looking from upwards downwards onto the player, you can't really see the door, and because of that reason you also can't really enter the door. I think that is very archaic. It's a bit, well, it's not necessarily lazy, but I think it would be much more interesting if towns felt more alive, if they had a lot more NPCs with proper draw distances where they don't spawn in 5 meters ahead of you, where you as a player could enter more doors, where you as a player can look through the windows, those kinds of things. That would make a town feel much more authentic, much more in line with modern standards set by games. But as for the overworld, I think that as for the next Pokemon game, it would be very interesting if they took a similar approach to Ni no Kuni with the overworld. That is to say that once you leave a major region, let's say that the next Pokemon game is as big as Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they could split up Kanto and Johto into several regions. And once you leave one region, much like how if you leave a castle in Ni no Kuni, the camera kind of zooms out, the world turns into a chibi mode of itself, and you can cover larger distances more quickly with your character, which allows for a wider diversity of biomes. Then, once you actually reach a point of destination, maybe a certain city, maybe a certain region within an ice biome or a desert biome, it zooms in somewhat more, as you would find in the wild area currently within Pokemon Sword and Shield, a camera more akin to a traditional third-person camera, whereas the overworld itself is more zoomed out. I think that a pretty good example of why this is useful is actually a set of 2 games, Guild Wars and Destiny. What you will find in Destiny is that it had to make its world very static in everything that isn't an instanced area. And I think that these instances, these destinations as I just mentioned them, are very important so that developers can craft more interesting, dynamic environments. So to go a bit more in depth, at the start of Destiny 2, the tower is under attack, and there all kinds of things happen on the tower. Enemies are invading the tower, NPCs are moving about, are interacting with the environment, are giving exposition to the player, telling them what is going on, crafting doors, grabbing weapons, telling you to stand in their shield, etc, 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 which makes the world feel alive. And that is something that the rest of Destiny often does not have, because these are uninstanced worlds, multiplayer worlds, which therefore have to be static, because if a bridge is exploded in your world, but it is an open multiplayer world, which Destiny often aims to have, then that bridge, if it is open for another player, will give technical issues, where that player can walk over the bridge and you cannot, which is kind of weird. On your screen that player might look like he's floating. Destiny kind of covered that by giving invisible walls that separate areas, but obviously Pokemon does not have that problem, because Pokemon is a single player game. Mostly anyway. Obviously there are still the trainer battles online, blah 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 blah, and the raids, etc etc, but those do not need a lot of dynamic environmental destruction or NPC interaction, because those are battles. So what would the instancing provide Pokemon? Well, you could have an overworld trip to a city which has a gym, and once you reach that gym, the actual doors get opened by the gym leader. Or from the overworld you enter a place that has a heavy storm, and during that heavy storm a certain building falls over, and that heavy storm might be caused by a legendary Pokemon, which you will then start to hunt. These kinds of events you can then script into the world to make it feel much more alive, to script NPCs as well, fleeing in terror from some rampaging legendary that has been affected by the enemy team from that game. Or maybe it's Team Rocket that's up to no good, terrorizing some random Pokemon that's trying to flee but is causing a mess along the way, like destroying stalls in a market, walking through a building's window or whatever. You can have much more interesting dynamic story events to keep the player motivated and interested, surprise players with what is going on. Like, imagine yourself getting a haircut for your character, and suddenly some random Tyranitar shows up outside of the window as part of a story event or a special quest that you activated by sitting at that particular hair salon. These things you can do, you can script by having these nice instance sections. And obviously having the overworld makes sure that the developers don't overwork themselves by creating a one-to-one world similar to Grand Theft Auto. Having this overworld with chibi destinations allowing you to travel farther quickly, less detail on them, is just a good way to conserve or preserve resources. Now finally I would like to talk a bit about a last addition to the story sections. I have now covered that I want there to be a more defined personality. I want the story to be slightly more mature, a bit more aimed at teenage audiences, without all too much angst. I'm not asking for some kind of depressed guy here whose family got killed and therefore he always wants revenge or whatever. That's not interesting to me. I think that's overdone. Instead, just have a bit more introspection in your character. I have asked for more dynamic events through the scripting of events within certain story sections. I have asked for more dynamic worlds that feel more alive, to also make the Pokemon world in general more believable. How about we take some inspiration from, for example, the Machokes in Oras, where the Machokes helped with somebody who was moving from place to place. They actually lifted up the boxes and stuff. I think we should see a lot more Pokemon being used for tools other than fighting, and having these scripted or more scripted detailed towns would be a good way to do that. Now finally, I think that finish off this improvement in presentation, what I would like to see in my ideal Pokemon game. Pokemon games should introduce animated cutscenes. And I know that technically speaking every single cutscene in Pokemon is animated because there is animation, but I mean traditional cel-shaded animation like you would see in the actual anime, like you would see in many of the game trailers. These are hand-drawn, digitally colored, animated cutscenes which make the world feel a lot more alive. This is also why at the start of the video, when I went into this topic, I mentioned that Game Freak should hire more traditional cel shading animators. It is for this purpose and this purpose only. Animate these big story moments, like the loss of your best friend's loss, your rival's loss to the Elite Four or whatever. You can actually have them draw sadness, have this moment where you experience a low, so that the Pokemon can come together to cheer up this trainer, so that you can experience a nicely animated high. Introductions to the main legendaries of the game. Like, can you imagine Zamazenta and Zacian being cell shaded, being completely animated as if it were a Pokemon movie during their introductions, to show off their strength and how intimidating they are, their personality. Those things are possible. This has been a staple of JRPGs for many years, not just Final Fantasy, not just Tales of, not just Persona. It is even part of low budget games, so Pokemon is definitely capable of doing this. And they already kind of have done it, considering some of the trailers. If you look at, for example, the RS trailer, it is an animated cutscene. So Pokemon can do that. And honestly, they should, because it improves the presentation hugely. And game graphics these days are good enough as to where it doesn't feel incoherent. I think that even old PlayStation 2 games like Persona 3, which has much worse graphics as compared to even Pokemon Sun and Moon, that game already had these animated cutscenes, and it felt seamless, and it hugely helped the presentation of the game. So I definitely think Pokemon would benefit from having these animated cutscenes. A cutscene where after you beat the Elite Four, all of them give your player a handshake. All of them congratulate your player, tell you like, hey, you beat us. Maybe all of their key Pokemon, kind of like how Lance has Dragonite, right? Some of these Elite Four members have their one key Pokemon. Steven has Metagross. Maybe these Pokemon could like do a little bow together with the Elite Four trainers to really show you their respect that you earned, the fact that you are now the champion. Now obviously these cell shaders can't draw your own Pokemon team, because drawing all of these Pokemons and then layering them correctly as per the team you chose is just a lot of work. So the game would have to keep it to animating just the iconic Pokemon of the Elite Four, and then move back to real-time cutscenes for your own Pokemon and whatever victory animation they will give you. These are currently my thoughts on Pokemon Sword and Shield, as well as my ideal Pokemon game as I would like to see it. I think that if Game Freak were to realize the console ambitions that they seem to have started on, if they keep on working on Pokemon games and improving, they could work towards a standard as I just mentioned, and I think that a high quality Pokemon product like this would leave a hugely positive impression on the entire community, as well as from a mechanics perspective, a world design perspective, as well as a story and graphics perspective. All of these could be much more modernized, much more interesting, and I think that this would really boost the sales of a game. I think that it would also help with long-term sales. I am very well aware, I have heard that Sword and Shield is selling very well, but I think that this is a short-term burst in sales. I am pretty confident in predicting that the long-term sales of Pokemon Sword and Shield will be a bit more on the low end, that they will taper off fairly quickly because of the negative market response Pokemon Sword and Shield has started to get from players and people who are just very disappointed with the game, including some very big channels who are even quite Nintendo oriented. People like Arlo, for example, have also expressed how in a way Pokemon has been kind of disappointing to them, and it didn't have to be. I think that people, including some friends of mine, have been giving me the argument that, well, Pokemon has been kind of the McDonald's of gaming for a while now. They haven't really been innovative for a long time now, but I don't think that makes it okay for Pokemon to keep on kind of lowering their own standards as compared to their competition more and more. I think that's all the more an argument for as to why Pokemon should start to innovate now again like they used to back in the day. Pokemon wasn't always below par in its presentation. Pokemon wasn't always a par in its mechanics. Pokemon used to be a leader in these fronts. It used to be the top of the game. That's why it got so popular in the first place. There was nothing else like Pokemon when it released. Gold and Silver having color was a big deal. Pokemon getting its rights to animate was a big deal. Pokemon moving into the 3D space, and actually kind of pushing the 3DS. To me, I think it's still one of the better looking 3DS games out there. Sword and Shield just isn't. These are my arguments for on how Pokemon could improve itself. Please leave your own ideas in the comment section. If you have your own suggestions or if you disagree with me on something, do tell me in the comments. Usually I respond. I might agree with you, I might disagree with you. You might even be able to change my mind on something. And if you do, all props to you. Good work. Have a good day, everyone. And until the next video, which will probably not be about Pokemon.